Michael Brenner, Director of the Center for Israel Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our event tonight. In 1902, Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, wrote a novel called Alt Neuland, Old New Land in English. Although written in the form of a utopia, Herzl wanted this vision of a future Jewish society in Palestine to be taken quite seriously. When he sent a copy of the novel to Lord Rothschild, Herzl wrote in a letter, "There will of course be stupid people who, because I have chosen the form of a utopia, which has been used by Plato and Thomas More, will declare the cause to be a utopia. I fear no such misunderstanding in your cause," he said, in your case. In another letter to German Chancellor von Bülow, Herzl emphasized, "I wrote the utopia only to show that it is none." Although Alt Neuland is set in Palestine, Herzl was tireless in trying to acquire a territory for the persecuted Jews of Eastern Europe and other places anywhere in the world. In fact, in a book he wrote a few years earlier, Der Judenstaat, or the Jewish State, he still mentioned Argentina, where the philanthropist Baron Hirsch had actually established agricultural Jewish settlements as a possible alternative. And later, he negotiated about Cyprus and El Arish. And when the British government offered part of their East African territory, they called it the Uganda Plan, although it was actually part of today's Kenya, Herzl considered this option seriously. 120 years after Herzl first proposed a Jewish state, and almost 70 years after this state actually came into existence, Herzl's vision or hope that the Jewish diaspora, that's what he thought, would actually ultimately dissolve when there was a Jewish state, did not become reality. While the state of Israel, of course, has incorporated many Jews from all over the world, there is even a certain irony. In addition to the Jewish diaspora, today we have an Israeli diaspora. Some of the members of the Israeli diaspora sitting here, perhaps. So it may be that after 2,000 years of wandering, settling down may just not be such a natural trait of the Jewish people. The constant struggle between home and exile, wandering and staying at home, is also a very prominent feature of Eshkol Nevo's work, especially of his novel Neuland, which, by the way, you can all purchase after words outside. A clear reference, of course, to Herzl's Alt Neuland, Old New Land, New Land. Nevo took Herzl's Neuland seriously, as Herzl wanted it to happen, and in a way he transplanted it into our own time. His novel ends with the description of a kind of therapeutic community for Israelis traumatized by war and conflict, established in none other of Baron Hirsch's former colonies in Argentina. Neuland is a temporary refuge for this group, not their new Jewish state. It's a temporary refuge until the renewed land of origin will develop a new vision that would attract its former citizens to return. When I read Neuland, I thought, and I'm saying this as a historian of Jewish history and of Israel, I thought this was really one of the most timely and most thoughtful novels dealing both with Jewish history and with the present Jewish situation. Eshkol Nevo knows what he's talking about. During his childhood, so I read, his family moved across Israel and also for a year to the United States, and by his own reckoning, he had lived in 12 or 13 homes before the age of 18. This rootlessness strongly influences his writing. When in an interview he says, "When I was writing Homesick, you could say that I was preoccupied with the question of home. Where is my home? What is my home?" It may just be appropriate then that the novel, I think, that established his fame and that remained in Israel on the bestseller list for about 60 weeks and is in all the Israeli school curricula, which Israelis know as Arba Batim Vega'agua, is translated as Homesick into English. This novel, which is part of the Israeli high school curriculum, is indeed a fascinating kaleidoscope through a kaleidoscopic portrait of Israel of the 1990s, just as his more recent novel, Hamikveh Acharon B'Sibir, deals again with the central question of Israel today, its immigrants and its conflicts also between religious and secular, and also the universal human issues Israelis share with everyone else. And in fact, this everyday life, I think, is another feature of his novels that often encounters surprise reactions by his foreign audiences. As Nevo explained himself, I was told repeatedly how surprised they, the foreign audiences, were to read that Israelis have love lives, that we listen to the same music as they do, that we have conflicts, but that we actually go on living together. Nevo also teaches creative writing in Israel, and I think he has constantly held up a mirror to Israeli society in his novels. This has long been recognized by critics worldwide. He has received a lot of prestigious literary awards for his work, not only in Israel, but also in Britain, in France, in Austria, and other places. And it is a true pleasure to welcome Eshkol Nevo to American University Center for Israel Studies, which is the first of its kind in the United States, established in 1998. And it is a place where we try to bring the most creative minds of Israel together. So please join me in welcoming Eshkol Nevo.
First of all, I must say that was an amazing introduction. I've been book touring all around the world. I think I've never been introduced so widely and thoughtful. Usually they take Wikipedia and they read it out loud. Specifically, my Wikipedia is full of lies. So it mainly makes me laugh. But thank you for doing this introduction. I'm very happy to be here in Washington. Haven't been here for a long time and forgot how beautiful the city is. Really amazing. I wanted to start with a poem by an American poet, Robert Frost. The poem is The Road Not Taken. Maybe you know it. For those of you who don't know, the poem speaks about someone who is standing in the woods, and two roads diverged in the woods, and he has to choose one road. But the roads are quite similar, so he doesn't know how to choose. He ends up choosing the road less traveled by. But he keeps on thinking about the road not taken, the life that he could have lived. So every time I meet Jewish communities, Israel studies faculty, ex-Israelis living abroad, every time I feel this sense of the road not taken. I am your road not taken, and you are my road not taken. My family came from East Europe. Half of it went to the United States, half of it went to Israel. Some of my friends, my Israeli friends, live in the United States, in Berlin. So this sense of the road not taken accompanies me while I'm book touring here. And it's also a central theme in the book I'm going to talk about, which is Neuland. I take into consideration that most of you haven't read the book yet. But don't worry, I will get you in the story. And I want to start by telling you how was the story born? Where did I get the idea from? And in order to do that, I have to take you to Guatemala. So come with me to Guatemala. And in Guatemala, there's a beautiful city called Antigua. Antigua de Guatemala, the old capital. Colorful houses, narrow streets. And in Antigua, there is an institution called Casa de Familia. Casa de Familia, the house of the family. If you want, you can join a local family and live with them for a week. The idea is that you will stop being a tourist and see how lives look from their point of view. And I thought to myself, it could be interesting to do it. In addition, the family speaks only Spanish. So if you want to survive this week, you have to improve your basic Spanish. I love Spanish. I think it's one of the most beautiful languages in the world. So I thought it's a good opportunity. And I joined the Casa de Familia. And besides me, there was another gringo in the Casa de Familia. And this gringo was, I would say, 65 years old Canadian man. And we were introduced at the beginning of the Casa de Familia. And the minute I saw him, I sensed this man has a story. I'm a story hunter, so sometimes I actually smell it. And so I smell the story. Now, if in retrospective, I can try to understand what was it. And I think there were two elements. First of all, his age. Back then, and I'm talking about 2001, you could not see 65 years old backpackers. This phenomena didn't exist yet. Nowadays, there's a very troubling phenomena of parents coming to visit their children while they are backpacking. When I think of my parents coming to visit me while I was backpacking, it will end up in tears, as we say in Hebrew. It would have ended. Anyway, it was quite rare at this age to backpack, but it wasn't only this. There was another element. This Canadian man was sad. Usually when people backpack or travel or go on vacations, even if they're not happy, they would pretend to be happy because they paid. They're supposed to enjoy. And he was not pretending. He was wearing his sadness like a shirt. And I thought to myself, this man is post something. And because I'm a story hunter, I approached him at the first minutes of this Casa de Familia, and I asked him, excuse me, sir, what brought you here? Then he looked at me and he said, I decided this week to speak only Spanish, so I cannot answer you in English. Now, I don't know till this day whether he was polite or telling the truth, but anyway, he was not willing to tell me what happened, what is his story. So I ended up looking at him. I did what I did while I was a child, riding the bus and looking at people in the bus and inventing stories about them. I did the same thing. We were together at a place much smaller than this place. There were 3 rooms. There was a shower outside. There was a grocery store. And we were walking. I was looking at him, and I had, by the end of this week, I had 4 different narratives explaining why is he backpacking and why is he sad. So, last morning of the Casa de Familia, I woke up very, very decisive. I'm going to confront this Canadian man and to find out what is the real story. But it turned out that he woke up before me and he left. And I never saw him again. The book came out in Canada a year ago. I went to book tour in Canada and I had a fantasy that I will tell this story. And in the back row, someone will say, this is me. But it never happened. I never met this man again. But he bugged me. Something about him bugged me. I was worried about him, curious about him. I went back to Israel, and I kept on thinking about him. And it's not always like that. Sometimes you meet people while traveling, and you just forget about them. I wasn't able to forget about him. So I did what storytellers do. I turned him into a story. In the story, he was already Israelized. He was an Israeli widower, because I don't understand nothing about Canadians. I had to turn him into Israeli. And he is so sad about losing his wife. He cannot stand his life anymore. He cannot stand staying in the place that she was with him, Israel, and he decides to go backpacking. And he gets lost. And his son has to look for him. I thought to myself, it could be interesting to switch the roles, because usually, who gets lost in South America? Young people, and their parents go to search for them. So I thought it could be interesting to write a story which is the opposite case. And I had this story in mind for years and years. I wanted to write it. And I also had the ending of the story. Sometimes people ask me, do you know the endings of your books? And usually the answer is no. In the case of Neulein, I knew how this story will end, and it was also connected to something that happened in the Casa de Familia. After the Canadian man left, we sat down for a last breakfast, desayunos, and the mother asked me if the fact that I'm from Israel means that I'm also from Jerusalem. And I said, yes, I was born in Jerusalem. And she asked me, is it true what she was told, that in Jerusalem there's a wall that you can put pieces of paper with requests from God? And I said, yes, the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. And then she asked me to take a wish, to take her piece of paper for her and to put it in the Western Wall. And she tore a piece of paper, wrote down her wish, and I took it, and I remember it was, I don't know if you remember once there were pouches, this ugly kind of, yeah? So I put it in my pouch, and then it looked not safe enough, so it went into my mochila. And then from the mochila, I got back to Israel. It was in my parents' house, and then I moved together to live with a girlfriend, and then we broke up. And then I went to live with my grandmother, and then I went to another. It traveled. This piece of paper traveled with me for more than a year, and I began thinking of it as kind of a chain letter, that if I would not pass it on, I will be punished. I will be ran by a train. And I ended up going to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, taking this piece of paper given to me in Guatemala. And while I was approaching the wall, I thought to myself, this is the ending of the story. The story about the son looking for his father in South America will end when this son will come back to Israel and put this piece of paper in the wall. So I had the beginning of the story. I had the ending of the story. Remained only one tiny problem. What happens in the middle? This took me a lot of time to figure out. I would say between 6 and 7 years until I understood what exactly I want to do in this book. I will read you a short piece from the beginning. This is the night. The son who is looking for his father is called Dori. And this is the night he is leaving to South America. He moves from Neta's room into the light and takes out of his pocket the list Roni prepared for him in her neat handwriting. He's crossed out all the items that are already packed in his suitcase or his hand luggage, but he still has the feeling that something is missing. He rechecks the usual suspects: passport, ticket, vaccination card, sunglasses, history book, the set of pictures of his father. Then he goes into the bedroom and finds Roni completely buried under her blanket, only a single curl visible. When they slept together the first few times in the apartment in Nachlaot, he was afraid that she'd suffocate. and he'd uncover her face when she'd fallen asleep. With time, it didn't worry him anymore. He traces the lock of hair with his finger till he reaches her head, and then Oni turns to him, reaches out and pulls him to her for a hug that surprises him. For the whole of the last week, she'd seemed to be anxious for him to leave. She spent the evenings locked in her study, claiming that those emails just create more and more work. And once, when he tried to touch her under the cover of darkness after they turned off their reading lamps, her body tensed and shrank back. "Take care of yourself there," she says now. Her eyes are still closed, and he wonders whether she's really half asleep or whether she's pretending, avoiding meeting his eyes as she's been doing all week, maybe even all year. "Take care of Neta," he says, and covers her again, thinking I'm really going, it's really happening. Then he takes off his wedding ring and puts it on the dresser because where he's going, you don't walk around flashing gold jewelry. Then goes back and turns off the lights, except in the bathroom. Neta screams if they don't leave it on. He takes in his last breath of the house, again thinking, what did I forget? What did I forget? What did I forget? Damn it. Then double locks the door and leaves the key in the fuse box next to the dead cockroach that has been lying there on its back for a month because no one has removed it. Night air enters his nostrils, but quickly turns into the cigarette smoke being exhaled by the driver, who offers to put his suitcase into the car for him. The driver looks about his father's age, so Dori does it himself, then gets into the back seat and drops his hand luggage next to him. "So, catching a flight, are we?" the driver asks. "Yes," Dori says, briefly, curtly, as matter of fact as possible. "Business or pleasure?" The driver continues his interrogation. "Neither," Dori admits. So this is the beginning of the book, the opening night. And I thought to myself when I started writing that I have a very clear narrative here. It's going to be a very simple book to write. But then trouble started. I knew I wanted Dori to meet a woman while he is traveling. He's a married man, he has a son. I knew I wanted him to meet a woman while he's looking for his father, and I knew I wanted this woman to shake his world, to be a kind of Neuland for him. But then I had to answer the question, what is Inbar, this woman, what is she doing in South America? She's 30, she's not in the age of backpacking, so what is she doing here? And I started writing pieces, short pieces about Inbar just for self-usage, just to understand what is her story. And then, after a couple of weeks of doing this, I realized that I enjoy writing about her more than I enjoy writing about him. And I ended up putting her story, her narrative in the book. Inbar goes to Berlin. Her mother is part of the growing ex-Israeli community in Berlin. She visits her mother, and while visiting her mother, she understands that she cannot come back to Israel. She does not want to come back to her boyfriend. She does not want to come back to her work, and she goes to the airport. She's supposed to come back, but she's just sitting in the airport, not wanting to come back, getting more and more drunk. And then she decides to just approach a counter of an airline and to ask, where is the next flight going to? And the answer she gets is Tehran, which is a bit problematic for an Israeli girl. So she asks, okay, what after Tehran? And they tell her Lima, Peru. And she goes to South America, unplanned, just like this. So I had two narratives. which is complicated enough to write and to balance. But then another thing happened. Inbar got a telephone call from her grandmother, Grandma Lily. And I actually fell in love with this grandmother. She was so heart-touching, and her Hebrew was beautiful, and she was really worried about her granddaughter, and she wanted to feed her through the phone. And I thought to myself, I have to have this grandmother in the book. I want her in the book. But then I had to answer the question, okay, I want her in the book, but it's a journey book, so what is the journey of this grandmother? I ended up giving her the journey of my own grandmother. The book, by the way, is dedicated to my grandmother. I'll read the dedication. For my grandmother, Bracha Frischberg, 1916-2010. If she hadn't made the journey from there, I wouldn't be here. So strange to read it outside, because the there and here are mixing. I was in Warsaw with this book 2 years ago, and it was a very emotional moment because I was looking for her house. She grew up in Warsaw, and you actually cannot find old houses in Warsaw because the whole city was ruined. So I ended up going in the neighborhood and just imagining how was it for her to be there. And anyway, Grandma Lily got the journey of my own grandma. My own grandma went from Warsaw just before the World War II broke. And from Warsaw, she went to Romania, and from Romania, she went on a boat to Israel, to Palestine. Now, it was the last boat to come to the shores of Palestine before the war broke out. It is a very famous boat. It's called the Tiger Hill. And the thing was that until I understood I want to write this story, my grandma was too old to remember it. She really tried. She was so thoughtful. She tried to remember for me. She understood that it was important for me, but she wasn't able to remember. And I ended up doing research, just finding journals and people and reading about other ships and trying to understand what was it to be late 30s on an immigration ship. How was real life on immigration ships? Not the myth, not the history, the historical facts. I wasn't interested in how many people were on the boat, what was the name of the captain. I wanted to know, for instance, was it possible to have a love affair on an immigration ship when you have 800 people on a very tiny boat? So I was looking for evidence in the journals of people who were on the Tiger Hill for love affairs. It took a while, but in the end, I found one. And it was an amazing story because on the boat, there were groups, and the groups were connected to youth movements. Now, the guy that was writing the journal was from Beitar, and he fell in love with a girl from the Shomer HaTzair. I think Republican and Democrat would not be enough to describe, right? Like Tea Party and, I don't know, ultra-left. And the thing is that for 3 weeks, he was writing and reflecting whether it's politically okay if he will make a pass. And he ended up deciding that it's okay, and he talked with her, and it happened. And through this journal, I found out how can you find intimate places when you have 800 people around you. So after a lot of research, I started writing the story of Grandma Lily. There's only one piece in this book which is true, which is a true story that my grandma used to tell us. We're now really close to Leila Seder, to Passover, so I thought it could be right to read it today. This is the story of the night that she left Warsaw, and she would tell us this story every Leila Seder. Grandma Lily. Her father, wearing a karakul hat, escorted her to the hotel where all the members of the Chalutz youth group had assembled, and left her at the foot of the stairs. "I'll stay here until it gets dark," he said. "Come outside again if you can." "But Papa," she protested, "only if you can," he hushed her, "and if not, that's all right too. We'll meet again in a few months in Eretz Yisrael anyway, won't we?" "And for that, I'll never forgive myself," she always says. The pain that story brings her has not dulled with the years. On the contrary, it has only grown sharper. "My father stood outside," she says, holding her wine glass without drinking a drop from it. "And standing outside there is not like it is here. There it's cold at night. There the rain is angry even in the summer. I'm not sure he even had an umbrella. But he stood there and waited for me, just for the chance that he might see me again. But you couldn't know, Grandma. No one knew then that..." Inbar always tries to convince her. "It doesn't matter," she says, refusing to make it easier for herself. "I went into that hotel and met up with all the other Chalutz members. We drank and danced and laughed, and I forgot that my father was waiting for me outside. The next day, we got on a train that took us to the port, and I never saw my father again." She tells that story at every Passover Seder, and Aunt Nira, who isn't really an aunt at all, but Grandpa's unmarried sister, talks about her escape from a British prison, and Uncle Simo tells about the great day on which he was liberated from a Syrian prison camp in the deal that was struck after the Yom Kippur War. Only she, almost despite herself, has to ruin the happy mood of those family stories of the exodus from Egypt with the story about her father, who waited in vain outside the hotel in that karakul hat. In his last letter to her, before the letters stopped coming altogether, he described how some thugs yanked it off his head in the middle of Warsaw and didn't give it back. When she finishes the story, the emptiness of the prophet Elijah's chair seems more present, and someone always begins to sing in an effort to lighten the oppressive atmosphere. And everyone joins in, shouting with raspy voices of people drunk on grape juice. Only she remains silent, her thoughts wandering to that journey. So I got myself into real trouble because I had 3 narratives to write: Dori's narrative, Inbar's narrative, and Grandma Lily's narrative. And this is coming back to the road now taken, the story ended up going to Argentina. In Argentina, I don't want to tell you too much, not to ruin the joy of discovery, but in Argentina, Dori will solve the riddle of his father's disappearance. Inbar will solve the riddle of the wandering Jew. We haven't talked about the wandering Jew, because what happens is that from day one, Inbar, from the first day that she is in Peru, she sees signings on the wall of the wandering Jew. The wandering Jew was here with a date. And wherever she goes, she sees the wandering Jew was here. And she wants to find out who is writing this. She will find out in Argentina. And also in Argentina, as Michael said, the road not taken comes into effect because the story of the Baron Hirsch, the story of the attempt to create an autonomy for Jewish people in Argentina is a fascinating story. It's actually untold in history lessons in Israeli. Nobody teaches it. I discovered it by chance, just reading someone writing an article in the internet. It's an amazing story. Besides Palestine, it's the only place where Jewish people actually gather together in a real attempt to make a place of their own. And one of the things this book is asking is what would have happened if the Jewish state would have been formed in Argentina and young Jewish people after the army would go backpacking in Israel. So this is as much as I can tell about the book without telling too much. And I think I will conclude with that. Thank you. Yep.
Continue. Thank you, Eshkol. I learned that you're not just a great writer, but a wonderful storyteller as well. So thank you really for telling us also about grandmother Lily and other things which I all didn't take out of the book. I'll just ask the first 2 or 3 questions, then we'll turn to the audience. So the main character is called Dori. Dori, of course, was actually the name Theodor Herzl, who grew up in Budapest, was called. It was his nickname. And I just wonder, and I guess that's the historian you asked the question, so you called it Neuland. It's really based in many ways, and it's in some ways even a parody of Alt-Neuland, of Herzl's book. I just wondered, I assume you must have read Alt-Neuland, and what impression it made on you, and how you would see Dori or Herzl today, or maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Alt-Neuland perspective.
First of all, I have to confess that I never thought of it. The Dori Theodore.
Really?
Never.
I can't believe that.
Never. I had
a book called Dori about him.
I had to come all the way to Washington. And now, whenever people ask me in Israel, how do you choose the names for your characters? I would know what to answer. Of course, it's because of Herzl. Of course, it's subconscious. Usually, when they ask me about Dori, I talk about the word Dor in Hebrew means generation. So I talk about the generational roles and the way I switched roles in this book, but now I have a better one. So you ask a serious question about Herzl, and actually I went back reading him. We study Herzl in high school, but it's taught in a very dull way, and I think when you're at the age of 17 or 18, you're not really ready to fully understand what was he trying to do or trying to imagine. Now, the thing I was fascinated about was to see the gaps between the vision and reality. What he had in mind and what really happens in Israel. And I think 2 things were really evident, or that came out immediately from the text. One is the way he thought of Israel, or as the country for the Jews, as Or LaGoim, as light for the Gentiles, as a country that will have wonderful relationship with all of the world, loved by all nations, popular, no BDS, no conflicts. He had this wonderful descriptions in the book of in what way this society, this utopia, could enrich the lives of other people. And while reading this, and specifically with the situation of Israel now, diplomatically around the world, I'm experiencing it on a personal level because I'm an Israeli writer, going with my books to places around the world in which Israel is criticized very harshly. And as a writer, I have to deal with these questions. And I feel it very strong, almost wherever I go, except Singapore. So this was one thing, and the other thing was he was not a communist or a socialist, Herzl, but the way he described the economical structure of the society, the future Jewish society, was very arvut adadit. People will be there for each other. It will be common. And while I was reading it, there was a big discussion in Israel. There was part of the zeitgeist of the time that I was writing the book what happened to the country that started with the kibbutz ideology and turned into a very capitalist, unmerciful kind of society. And actually, when the book came out in 2011 at May 2011 in Israel. And there are descriptions in this book of people in Neuland, in this imaginary place in Argentina, young people sitting and having ideological discussions about the future of Zionism. Now, when the book came out in May, people read this description and told me, this is science fiction. Young people would never sit and talk ideology. They're too focused on themselves and their little tiny problems. But actually 2 months later, July, the 10th revolution, the 10th demonstrations in Israel started. And I remember myself going in the Rothschild Boulevard, and actually young people were sitting there and talking about what is Zionism now. If Zionism was for our parents and for our grandparents, having a safe territory for Jews. For our generation, this is not enough. What meaning does it have besides a safe territory? What kind of values does it stand for? So this is, I think, it got into the book.
Thank you. Actually, Shimon Peres, about 10 years earlier, wrote a book where he imagined himself with Theodor Herzl going through Israel, and it was a Old Newland revisioned or rewritten. And he admitted in the introduction that he had never before read Old Newland, and I'm sure that is the very typical. It is, by the way, I think it's not the greatest piece of literature, but it's really worth reading. But of course, you told us about your grandmother. There's also a famous grandfather. You're named after Levi Eshkol, who was your grandfather and the Prime Minister of Israel. And I just wonder, was this kind of figure a big presence in your? Was this someone to aspire to? I assume you never, because you were born after he died, I think. But
yeah, he died in '69. Yeah. I was born in '71. I didn't know him, and I feel very sorry about that because I hear a lot of stories about him. People approach me. It even happened in Cleveland. A woman approached me and told me about a very special moment she had as a child with my grandfather coming to their town. She was chosen to be the representative of the town, a 5-year-old blonde girl with flowers giving to the prime minister. And people tell me amazing stories about my grandfather. And the character that I can portray through these stories is the kind of man I would want to meet, because somehow he was a mensch. He was a politician, and yet he was able to create a sense of human contact with people he worked with and people he was negotiating with. He had a sense of humor, and he was also a good father, which is amazing because he didn't have time. He was the prime minister, and my mother, who is his daughter, she had a very strong father figure. She grew up knowing that her father loves her, and she talks about him with a lot of love. And I as a father of 3 daughters, I always think to myself, how did he do it? He didn't have time. He was running the country. So I wouldn't say it was a shadow, but I definitely grew up in a very political family. and a very involved family, opinionated. We were going to demonstrations since I was, 2 or 3 years old, on the shoulders of my parents. And I'm very much attached to my country. I have, talking about Neuland and ex-Israelis and colonies, and I could never imagine my life outside of Israel. I'm very, very connected. Sometimes it seems impossible to live in Israel. Sometimes this place makes me so angry, but I'm attached also strongly.
I feel that was one of the interesting parts in reading Neuland, that you have this alternative, the road not taken, and the Argentinian way. I think, by the way, there were, after that, I think there are a few more books. One about Uganda, where there is a Jewish state in Uganda, and the Jews who founded the state go backpacking to Israel, or to Palestine, whatever. But what I found interesting in your novel is that you don't make it a new and alternative state. You make it kind of a temporary asylum until the society is healed or something like that. And I found that very fascinating.
Yeah, it's first we have to also talk about why they need to be healed. This is, I must say, it's also connected to the feeling I got while book touring and meeting ex-Israelis. Sometimes it feels like the waves of immigration from Israel are timed by wars. You have the 73 wave, you have the 82 wave, and then you have the recent wave from 2000 and on. And when I talk with these people, I feel that for them it was too much. And the question of when will it be too much, or how much can a society, how long can a society be in this constant state of war, is a question in this book. It's an anti-war book. And the reason that these people need to be healed is that they are suffering from post-trauma, which is not classic PTSD, but just being there makes you a different person. I sense it's very strong when I speak to Israelis. I feel it when I am book touring. Even if you spend 2 days in Cleveland, you already feel a bit different in your body because there are no threats around in Cleveland, beside the snow. It's people
and
in
2 days are enough, right?
What?
And 2 days are enough.
yeah. I've been talking. Yeah. It's a society living in a constant conflict, and as you said, making love and having parties and eating and writing, but it has a price, and this book is also talking about the price.
I think we'll open it up. I'm sure there are a lot of questions in the audience. Laura?
Hi, my name is Elisa Katz. I want to thank you very much for being here. This last comment you just made, I just wanted to put it in juxtaposition to being an American Jew and going to Israel, having been there many times, but especially the first several times that I've been, always having that feeling of coming home and a sense of settling in to a space as opposed to what you just described as coming to the States from Israel. And I just find that so interesting that we are all Jews and we have some kind of kernel of shared experience, yet these two places that we're undeniably connected to make us feel totally opposite. And so I was wondering if you could speak to any idea, I mean, given your breadth of experience in your teaching with students, I mean, how we might be able to reconcile those two, that divide between those two existences of the American and the Israeli experience.
I'm not sure we have to reconcile. It's part of the beauty that you have two experiences. But when you talked it, I remembered last summer I met groups of Birthright. 7 different groups they came to meet me after they were in Masada, in the snake trail. They were exhausted. So after one lecture that I saw that they were falling asleep, I decided I cannot do a lecture with these guys. I have to do the shortest creative writing course ever, which lasted 30 minutes, in which I asked them to write about their experience in Israel and the conflicts that they saw. It was amazing to see, by the way, that even though Birthright is a very scheduled kind of program, the organizers of Birthright want these young people to see specific things, but they see other things. They are intelligent enough to understand the situation. And the amazing thing was that I asked them at the end of this conversation, I asked them, how many of you can imagine yourself living in Israel after these 10 days? And I got 80% as an answer. And this is, I think, connected to what you were talking about, this kind of coming home sense that they had, which is fascinating to me. And it goes the opposite way, because I never thought of myself, when I began writing, I thought of myself as an Israeli writer, not as a Jewish writer. Only when my book started being translated and I went to meet Jewish communities and I felt understood in a level I wasn't understood when I went to Singapore or when I was talking with Italians, just in a festival in Mantova. I felt something is connecting, kind of a sixth sense of memory, of homesickness, of longing, and so now I know I'm a Jewish writer. Now I have acknowledged that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. You talk so much about the utopian version of Argentina. Having worked in Argentina for the IMF, the reality is a nightmare. And how do you sort of reconcile this image that Baron de Hirsch had of this beautiful place that became a refuge for Nazis and horrendous violence? And I apologize, not having read the book yet, but are you able to weave that into the story?
First of all, I have to say that I love Latin America, really. One of the reasons I wrote this book, and I didn't talk about it before, is that the first time I got to South America was 1995, after the army, and I landed in Quito, in Ecuador, and I will never forget the first moments of walking in Quito. I never felt something like this before in my life. I felt that I was here already. I'm not a very spiritual New Age kind of guy. I felt this is my home away from home. I fell in love with Spanish. Since then, I've been 7 times in Latin America. Now I have books translated to Spanish, so I have a professional excuse to go there. And I started asking in my family, do we have Latin roots? Anyone was an Indian? But no. So this very strange feeling of feeling so comfortable in a place, it never happened to me, nowhere in any other place in the world. So comfortable. Part of the reason I wrote the book was to come back there and to find out. Now, you talked about Argentina. Yes, there were horrendous years at the 70s in Argentina, and yes, it was a refuge for Nazis. But if you think about the story of the Baron Hirsch, for, I would say, 20 or 30 years, it was a very good solution for East European Jews prosecuted and targeted and threatened, and there was no Palestine yet. They had nowhere to go. And when World War II started, again, it was a very good refuge. So I met a lot of people while book touring with this book who told me, yes, my parents went, the route was from Eastern Europe to the colonies of the Baron Hirsch, trying to do agriculture and then discovering that they have to do Luftgeschäft, they have to go to Buenos Aires and be in the big city, and then moving to Israel or to the United States. Depends on where I'm book touring. And so I think the Baron Hirsch, in a way, succeeded in what he wanted to do, but because Herzl's plan was more effective, the state of the Jews was founded in Israel, in Palestine.
There was actually one passage where Herzl says early on in his diary, he says the Jewish state should be built in Palestine or in Argentina. I believe it will be in Argentina.
Yeah. And he says the weather is better in Argentina because he didn't enjoy so much his visit in Palestine, if you read his writings. So it's a fascinating chapter in the history of Jewish people.
And I just may say one more thing. We originally planned to have this event at in part of our Global Israel series, where we go to embassies, at the Argentinian embassy. But I think is the Argentinian president scheduled to visit around this time or something like that, so they couldn't do it. But we'll do it another time.
Yeah, it's Donald Myers. You had mentioned about your grandmother coming from Warsaw, and my grandmother came from Białystok, and I went back to Białystok, and I found an exciting experience and also traveling around Warsaw. But I'm interested, to what extent are Israelis interested in connecting with their roots back in Eastern and Central Europe, or have they moved on from trying to reconnect and find their roots?
First of all, and this is connected to something that Michael said. One of the things he said is, or asked, is after Jews got their own territory, is there still a wandering Jew? Is there still a wandering Jew inside the Israeli? Is the fact that Israelis travel so much connected to the wandering Jew? And coming back to your questions, one of the most fascinating phenomena in Israel, and it started, I would say, around the Second Lebanon War, 2006, people are finding their Polish roots in order to get a Polish passport. Just in case.
Then they go to Berlin.
Then they go to Berlin, yeah. Just in case, yeah. So yes, people are connecting, sometimes practically to get a passport, sometimes they are interested in the history of their family. You asked before, the lady sitting beside you asked about the creative writing courses, the teaching I do. One of the most common themes in my students' stories, I get once a workshop, a story about the, how do you say Mitzadei Chaim? Mitzad Chaim. The March of the Living. They take 70 years old high school students in Israel to the March of the Living. It's kind of a hike, and they are full of hormones, and they're in the bus, and they're going to Auschwitz. And so it's such a confusing and ambivalent experience for them that they carry it on for years, and then they come to the writing workshop when they are 30, 35, and they write about it. So this is also something very dramatic happening. There's thousands of people going every year and connecting to this experience and to what happened there. And of course, getting confused.
And if I may add just one example, one other well-known Israeli writer, Edgar Keret, moved temporarily to Warsaw and built what I think he called the smallest or narrowest house. We'll hope to have him here, by the way, in the fall as well.
One of the things you said was that people are now sitting in cafes and talking about the future of Israel as they did when Israel was formed, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are the countervailing views that people are talking about?
What are?
What are the differences, the different views that people have of what Israel should be at this time?
Wow, that's a big question. I cannot summarize the complexity of Israeli politics. I would. The what? The common view. No, I'm trying to choose because there's so many conflicts that I have to choose. I think I would say there are two prominent, and I'm talking about 2016, not 2011. What now is really in a dispute, or people are arguing about, is in what way the relationship between secular and religious. In Israel, it also comes into politics. It's not only about what kind of synagogue are you going to, it's about political power and about the Minister of Education deciding what kind of books will be learned. And for instance, banning a book which is about a love relationship between a Palestinian and a Jew in New York, because the book is encouraging itbolelut. How do you say itbolelut? Assimilation. He claimed that it encourages assimilation. So this is a big dispute now in Israel because part of the government is very religious. And of course, there is the issue of the relationship with the Palestinians. What kind of moral price do we pay as Israelis with this conflict continuing and continuing? What kind of moral choices soldiers are confronted with? How do you reconcile the need to defend yourself? Nobody has a question that Israel has a need to defend itself. It has a lot of enemies. But how do you reconcile this with the want to be moral and to stay loyal to the fact that you come from the Jewish tradition and you are supposed to be sensitive to vulnerability? And this is a big dispute now in Israel. And democracy. Not all of the parts of society support democracy. Not all parts of society see democracy as a basic value in the country. So there's a lot of argument about this. And I could go on. We can have 2 hours of summary.
I have a very practical question.
Practical question,
Having
yes.
read both of these books, when is the next one available in English?
When is the next one? Besides Neuland and Homesick? First of all, you have World Cup Wishes, which is available through Amazon. And I am now negotiating with publishing houses in the United States, and I hope that 2017 we will have a new book in English. I hope so. I hope so. I hope so. Either Shalosh Komot, 3 stories, or The Last Mikveh in Siberia. One of them, I hope, will be in English. That was practical.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, who is a wandering Jew, born in Afula, and from there to here, and then eventually to China and back.
China.
But you mentioned Herzl, of course, and Alt Neuland, and I have a connection with Herzl because my great uncle was in Basel in 1897 at the first Zionist Congress. And at that time, and shortly thereafter, Herzl said 2 things, at least. He said, in 5 years, but certainly in 50 years, there'll be a Jewish state, number 1. But secondly, he said also that he felt that once the Jews were gathered in one spot, they would not be able to get along with each other. And I say that also because I go to Israel every year, of course, and last year when I took a taxi from my brother's farm to a Lod, I was talking to the taxi driver, and he said the problem in this country is we cannot get along with each other. So my question is, how do you see Israel getting along or not getting along? And the second question, what would Herzl say about Israel today?
The second question is easier because it's It's in the book. The book is a kind of an expression of what would have Herzl said about Israel, the gap, and in what way it could be filled. The first question about getting along, I can answer from my own experience of being a teacher. I've been teaching for, I would say, 16, 17 years now in creative writing courses. And 2 years ago, we opened a national school for creative writing. And one of the reasons we did it is that we found out that in these classes of creative writing, people learn how to be tolerant and how to listen to each other. It's amazing to see the difference between the first lesson and the last lesson. You get in the same room, it's 15 people, in the same room you get settlers and hipsters from Tel Aviv, old people, young people, rich people, poor people. You see the first lesson, you see the labels on the forehead. You see them talking to each other and thinking about the labels, not about the human being. And then after the workshop ends, and after a semester, and after they read each other's text, they discover that the other is not so intimidating. For instance, one thing that was amazing for me as a secular Jew, I have this wave of religious students coming to study in my workshops. And to find out the way that the religious society in Israel is changing, it's not yet politically evident. Politics are not reacting yet to the fact that the new generation of religious people in Israel is different. You have feminists writing about the position of the woman in Orthodox Judaism. You have erotic texts written by religious women. This if somebody would have told me 10 years ago I would get this kind of text, it will be legit to write them, to publish them. One of my Shir HaShirim, yeah. But Shir HaShirim is legit. But one of my students just got, a couple of days ago, she got a yes from a publishing house. She's religious. She's living in a religious community. And while I was accompanying her in the process, I was asking her all the time, do you have the courage to go through the process? Do you understand? And she said, yes, it's about time. It's about time that it will be, we're talking about. It's in the subtext. Everybody's, it's changing, but still nobody has the courage to put it out. So because I see these phenomena, I think it's possible. Of course, you have to get a leadership that is interested in getting people together and not dividing them. And this is crucial, I think.
To an end, but we have 1 and 2 more.
First of all, I have to say that that this is probably the best novel I have read in 10 years. This is a phenomenal novel, and I've read it, and I'm reading it in translation, and even in translation, it is amazingly beautiful. The language is extraordinary. So that said, it's a phenomenal novel. I have a question. You recreated Alt-Neuland as a very different kind of place, as a kind of therapeutic community in Argentina, very different from the Neuland that Herzl and his companion, well, the characters discover on their way back from, on their second visit to Palestine and discover Alt-Neuland, is very different. But there are also many, many similarities. They're both very communal, they're both very communitarian, they're both very struggling a lot with, thinking a lot about issues of humanity and things of that nature. So I have a question. You recreated Alt-Neuland your way. Where did Herzl go wrong in his description? Because his didn't work out.
First of all, I'm not sure. First of all, thank you for what you said. I'm really, it's really beautiful and it never stops to amaze me. I get to Washington and suddenly I have this passionate reader in line number 5. I'm not sure that Herzl was wrong. I would not say this, that he was wrong. Sometimes when people ask me, do you believe in the fact that books have an effect on people? I tell them, Altneuland. This is a book that changed the history of a nation. So I'm not sure that he was wrong in his intent, but for one example, if you read the way he describes Palestine and his vision, he doesn't take into consideration at all that they are Arabs in this country, in this land, that they think that this is their land also. The way that he describes the Arab characters in Alt-Oilad is funny. It's comic. So I think that he was not living there, he was a visitor. And there was a limit in which he could understand the complexity of the place that he is imagining. And this is one example, but I wouldn't say that he was wrong. I would say maybe that we are wrong in the way we are, what we are doing with his vision.
I hope we can talk about this a little bit. The PTSD that is a major factor in the book. To what extent do you think that the PTSD from the 73 war has really had an impact in terms of, I guess, your generation and the generation that followed? Did you know about your fathers coming back very damaged?
I think the root of my interest in PTSD went like this. I was a soldier in the first Intifada, and I have experienced all sorts of things there. And actually, I never really talked about it or thought about it for a long time. I went out of the military service. I went out of the Intifada at 1992, 1991. And I was backpacking in South America in 1995. So it's 4 years after. And suddenly on the road from Bolivia to Brazil, there's a bus of 28 hours. Suddenly I had a friend with me traveling, and suddenly I started having flashbacks, real flashbacks. And the poor guy had to listen 28 hours to my stories and my moments. And when I wrote Neuland, I thought about the fact that a journey brings out all sorts of things. It can make you very happy, it can make you very sad, it can make you homesick, it can make you reflect, and also it can bring out things that you don't want to bring out. And this is what happens to Manny Peleg. Now, Manny Peleg is a Yom Kippur veteran, and my father was a psychologist during the Yom Kippur War. Now, the thing is, he never talked about it. I think now I see it with my own daughters. I think children sometimes sense things that are unspoken. My father was very proud of what he did. He would show us places in the Golan, in Sinai, and tell us what kind of combat, what kind of battle did they have there, but he never talked about his work as a psychologist. So, but I remember people, I was a really tiny child, and my first memory is from the Yom Kippur War, my first vivid memory, and I remember later on, like 2 or 3 years afterwards, people coming in and out of our house, something is wrong with them, and as a child, I'm not sure what is it. So it was in the air. And in a way, I wrote about Yom Kippur because about the Intifada I couldn't write. I could not deal with it. So this was my way of dealing with it. And yeah, every year has its own wave. My daughter, there were two. I live in Ra'anana, which was originally, until half a year ago, a very boring suburb. And suddenly we had terrorist attacks in Ra'anana, and my daughter, the last thing I did before, I was on the plane from Tel Aviv to Newark, and the plane got delayed, and I saw my cell phone, I saw the name of my daughter, and I answered, and I was in the plane, and she wanted me to talk with her while she was walking from school home, because since what happened, she is really terrified to walk. So we were like this, talking and talking and talking, and I was happy because she's a teenager. She doesn't want to talk with me usually. So I was so happy that she's paying attention, and until she got home. So yeah, it's kind of a price we pay.
Thank you so much. I heard you. There is a limited number of books out there. Whoever comes first gets the books. They're there for sale, both this and Homesick. And I think we had a really wonderful evening of both your talk and discussion. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.